Welcome to SF Commercial Property Conversations with Bruce Bean, where Bay Area investments meet expert insights. Get ready to unlock the strategies of commercial real estate success.
So today we have Jerry Vinci with us, and Jerry is in the senior housing world. So Jerry, it's great to have you. I have not, after 290 some podcasts, I don't think I've ever talked with somebody about senior housing. So this is going to be great. I look forward to hearing how you got into where you are and what's happening in this big world of senior housing.
Thanks for having me, Bruce. Appreciate it. And I've been on quite a few investing in real estate driven shows, and it's pretty surprising to me that this topic hasn't been more of a focal point. I feel like senior housing in general has it's either been something where people are very clued in on this asset class, or they've just been told to steer clear of it because of how complex it is. So I definitely understand both arguments.
Yeah, no, I mean, my mother went through, independent living and assisted living and memory care. And so I've kind of seen this. We've got a good friend in Boulder, Colorado that's now
Mm-hmm.
102. So anyway, and FYI, we have a Rotary Club, Rotary Club of San Mateo, that has 130 odd affordable senior units and trying to build another 50 to 70 units. So fortunately or unfortunately, I'm somewhat familiar with this category, so I'm interested to see what you have to say about kind of the investment side of senior housing.
Yeah, and I can just give you a little bit of background information for your audience too on how I kind of got my start in this space. So, I'm not, I don't run multifamily. I'm not a syndicator, so that I'm not coming at this conversation from that angle. But what I do is I do run two firms that both work in the senior housing space. One on the operator facing side of senior living, and one on the capital facing side. So on the operator side, CCR Growth is the name of our agency, and we work directly with the operators themselves on demand generation, on marketing and sales, and essentially help operators build the revenue engine that will help them optimize, sustainably reach and maintain full occupancy in their buildings. And then on the capital side, my agency is called Nordon. That's Nordon. And this is where we work with investors and lenders and capital partners who basically need an independent read on what's actually happening at the community level, separate from what the operator's reporting. Because as most of us know, any type of financial due diligence is typically done on a deal like this. It's the operator themselves that's providing that information. And in our experience, it's been less accurate than or they're not even looking at the right data points to make those choices. A good example would be most investors, they're looking at, say, occupancy or census, right? Like how full is the building? And then they're looking at the NOI number and saying, okay, where is that in relation to their occupancy? But there's a lot of other data points that matter and that will impact NOI and will impact occupancy that they may not even see coming. And so that's where our diagnostic tools on the capital facing side will help identify those so that investors can either decide, is this asset really worth what they say it's worth, or is there something wrong? And if so, can I fix it and get this functioning and performing back to the way it should be?
So I'm curious, are most investors coming in as experienced investors in the senior world, or are some of them coming in kind of as newbies to this whole asset class?
I mean, it depends. There's quite a few different access routes. I mean, for like high net worth investors, for example, it's not necessarily something that I would say most people come in and just say, yeah, I want to go buy that community today. Most
Right.
of the time, they're looking, first and foremost, they're looking at like public REITs. That's usually like the safest bet, right? So like you hear companies like Welltower, Ventus, or HealthPeak. There's a handful of other ones too, but that's like the most liquid way to get senior housing exposure because you could buy shares tomorrow. And then, aside from that, there's like private REITs, and then there's syndications where, say like a sponsor finds a deal and then he or she's looking to raise capital from investors. So those are typically the three ways that people would get into this space.
So you have a kind of six step or six items that you look at in a senior housing. Can you kind of just run through a few of those with us?
Well, those diagnostic tools are different based on what the goal is of the diagnostic that we're running. So, for example, if we're running like a pre-acquisition diagnostic, this is an investment committee or team or person that is looking at essentially determining whether this asset is valued properly, if it, what's the risk associated with that asset. So they're going to be asking questions like, okay, if this is a pre-existing asset that's already performing in the market, can this operator continue to perform and deliver what they've already delivered? So our diagnostic tool is going to run through essentially everything that we're doing on the marketing facing side of senior housing. So we're going to look at their digital footprint. We're going to look at their visibility in the market. We're going to look at their reputation. We're going to look at the systems that they have in place within. Do they have a CRM? Do they have proper follow-ups in place? Is their sales team following up in a timely manner? Are they taking a week to get back to prospects? Like, we're going to look at all of those things and make determinations and report based on that information that we can find. The cool thing about what we do is we don't necessarily need access to the community or access to the operator or any of their internal systems to determine those things. A lot of times we can see those things externally. Like, for example, if I do a search for senior living in Phoenix, Arizona, or assisted living in Phoenix, Arizona, and I don't see this community anywhere in the search results, I know for a fact that they have a visibility problem in the market. So I'm going to want to do everything I can to improve that in order to increase the valuation of that asset. If that makes sense. There's other situations. Another big one is the transition diagnostic, where there's a lot of times where an existing asset will be purchased by a new investment group. There's that time lag between the time that the deal's inked and the time the keys change hands. So we want to evaluate how is the asset performing when that deal was inked versus how is that asset performing when the keys change hands, because often those things are not the same. And sometimes it's been 6 months. So in those 6 months, what has happened, right? Has occupancy increased? Has it decreased? Has the lead volume dropped in half? And if so, what should we expect for the next 6 months in terms of occupancy? So we're going to be looking at all of those types of numbers in a diagnostic report like that. But ultimately, our goal is to help investors make sound decisions based on actual data that is independent of the operator itself. That way, because a lot of these deals nowadays, the investment committee will literally be able to choose the operator that they want to run that asset. It's not inherent that operator comes with it. It may be separate.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay. So I'm just curious, how often does a senior facility trade hands?
I mean, there's all different types of living options, and all of them have kind of a different set in terms of performance. If you look at like independent living, for example, that typically covers anything that's like 55 plus, right? So it's someone or maybe a married couple who are looking to downsize, simplify their life, live amongst their peers, things like that. But it's not necessarily requiring like a higher level of care or some more complex living arrangement than they have right now. So for them, maybe it's just a simplification. Whereas like assisted living, you're looking at like they call them points. So like depending on someone's level of need, there's going to be a higher number of points that are tacked on to essentially their baseline rent or baseline cost of living there. So say like assisted living, baseline's 5,000, but mom needs help getting dressed, she needs help showering, and she needs help with her meals. It's going to be another 2,500 on top of that every month. So there's just a different point system that gets assigned to each of those levels. So that kind of creates this level of complexity of where people are getting into the market, and then like how are they determining how those assets are performing. It gets to be a little complex. So if you want to focus on one, we can say like what would be the criteria for that, but to look at all of them as a whole, it'd be pretty difficult.
Yeah, no, this sounds very complex to try and figure out all these different items and so forth. So I am not familiar with these REITs that you mentioned. So it's interesting. How are these REITs performing? Are they giving good returns?
Um, I would say because your audience is already kind of understanding that we're looking at long-term investments here. There's no real short-term gains that are going to be won by these types of assets. Most of the time with a publicly traded REIT, for example, I mean, just like anything, right? If you were going to invest in artwork, for example, and I just say that because I was just listening to someone talk about that, but 98% of what's in that portfolio is probably not going to generate much revenue at all, if anything. It's there's going to be a few performers, and then there's going to be one or two that are just out of, performing amazingly well. Those are the ones that are going to be the money makers, and everything else is probably not going to be so much. So I think there's always going to be that general risk when you go with like a fund, because you don't really have control over which properties and which operators are in that fund. Of course, you can look at that data beforehand, but it would probably be difficult to know that without, someone having that inside senior housing expertise to know. Because again, like you can look at two operators. A good example of this would be like you could look at an operator that's running a building at like 90% occupancy and say, oh, they're doing pretty good, versus a competitor who's running at 75% occupancy. But then you find out that the guy who's running at 90% occupancy gets 80% of their leads from a third party aggregator source like a Place for Mom or caring.com. And if anyone's shopped for a mortgage before online, they know exactly what I'm talking about, where you put your info into one website and you get 10 people calling you from
Yeah.
10 different lenders.
Yeah, no,
It's
it's terrible.
horrible, right? It's the
Yeah.
same exact thing in senior living where, a Place for Mom will literally send that one lead to 10 different communities, and now 10 different salespeople are calling this one family who's already dealing with a stressful crisis situation, and now they're having to field all these phone calls. So that becomes inherently difficult in that whole process of like the guy that was sitting at 90% is actually not that lucrative because he's getting these leads from a third party source, and now he has to pay for every move in that he gets from those leads. He's got to pay a full month's rent.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes if you're relying on, and if you have a lot of turnover in your community, it might be months before you ever even get out of the red for one resident. So that 90% occupancy could be a very misleading number versus a 75% occupancy of a building that owns every one of their leads and didn't use a third party source at all. So yeah, so numbers will tell a very different story depending on contextually how everything else is kind of feeding into those.
So I'm curious, I mean, for a actual facility that decides they want to sell, I've never tried it, but where do they go? They probably don't go to CoStar LoopNet to list their product. There must be some other place they go.
I mean, it's a pretty well networked industry. Most of the time, if a community is up for sale, someone else already is aware of the deal and is actively working to pursue it. We manage communities in 24 states right now for a variety of operators and investment committees, and it varies greatly, but I will say that a lot of the assets that are owned by multiple groups. So we've got, for example, one group of 40 communities that's owned and operated by one entity, but there's actually about 3 or 4 different entities that have ownership stake in those.
Oh,
So at any point in time, if this entity decides, hey, I would like that community in my portfolio, I'm going to take over 51% ownership of it. They will move and interchain those communities. So there's actually about 200 plus communities in that portfolio, even though the one that we manage only has about 40 in it. So there's a lot of moving, and I'm not saying like every deal is like that, but overall within like the regional operators, you see that quite a bit, that there's quite a few capital facing like investment committees involved in that. It's usually not just an operator who owns the asset outright. And what you're actually seeing is, like in the past, you would see a lot of like the triple net leases that are coming and then basically the investment committee is just cashing the rent checks and calling it a day. But now they're getting into these shop deals where they're senior housing operating partners where they're actually inherently tied to the operator. So if the operator's performance goes up, then the entire fund makes more money because of it. So that's been a big change that's happened not recent, but or I would say over the last decade, we see a lot more of that. So they're the investment and the operator are now like locked at the hip, whereas before they weren't.
So how often do they change operators?
I mean, it's harder than you might think, just because like so much of the performance of that asset is going to rely on the operator themselves, and I think that's probably something that um, most investors kind of need to understand about. It's an operating business inside of a real estate wrapper. So you're not buying a building with tenants, you're buying a building plus a service operation, plus a clinical operation, plus a sales operation, So it is complex, and to think like I'm just going to swap this operator out with another one can be challenging. A lot of operators, senior living is extremely hyper local in terms of your clout that you have in a specific area. So if one operator gets swapped out for another one, a lot of times that can reputationally be very difficult to overcome for that building. A lot of times too, there's the staff is inherently tied to the operator. So if the operator leaves or the executive director leaves, all of upper management might leave with them. And so that's going to create major problems in terms of staffing, in terms of retention of your residents, and then just like long-term growth just completely gets cut at the knees.
This sounds, well, I mean, hotels are very difficult assets to manage also. And there's different layers to hotels. They add a flag to it, which makes it even more complex. But at any rate, this is not an easy asset class to understand and do. I assume you don't become a listing agent for a property that wants to sell, or is that part of your services also?
No, what we do with Norden, we do have an exit diagnostic. So if someone is looking to sell and they're looking to get out and they want to increase or at least maintain the value of the asset that they have, we can again run an independent set of diagnostics to help underwriters really understand exactly what's happening with that asset. Because a lot of times, if the operator is the only one providing information towards that deal, it's hard sometimes for the buyer or the seller to justify the price, right? Because they're just dealing with information that's just not entirely accurate, or maybe it's not market facing information that's really going to say like, yeah, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this asset will still produce or it won't produce. So we can look at exit planning and help with that piece of it as well if we need to. But
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say too, it's interesting that you mentioned about hotels, right? Because it's a lot of times people are like, oh, well, it sounds more like running a hotel than owning real estate. That's a good observation. But it's closer, it's structurally closer to hospitality than it is to multifamily. But
Interesting.
with hotels, you've got short stays, you've got dynamic pricing, but which are all things that hotels deal with, but cap rates are different with hotels because hotels, that demand profile changes, right? Depending on the economy. If things are good, people are traveling, businesses are spending more money on travel, things like that. But when the economy slows, that disappears completely. Whereas with senior housing, it's essentially like demand inelastic, right? So when the economy slows, mom's still got dementia, dad still fell and needs help. So those needs don't necessarily go away. So you're getting paid for the operating complexity, essentially. Even if the demand stability that hotels would kill for the stability that that senior housing has, is what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say.
I'm sure. I mean, it's a longer stay, obviously, than
Yeah.
a hotel normally has. So I'm curious, do you have any stats on how many of the tenants inside of the senior living facilities have long-term healthcare insurance?
Fewer than you would think.
Uh,
It it's surprising how many people I've heard say they didn't know that that was a thing until their parent or loved one needed to be in some higher level of care. It's not often something that people think about, and a lot of communities actually don't do a good enough job of explaining that that's something that could be helpful. There isn't a whole lot of planning. I actually just got off another interview with someone who wrote a book on this, but they said there's essentially two types of people who enter senior living. There's uh, the crisis families, the ones that don't plan for anything, which is the majority, and then there's the planners, who tend to have everything mapped out far in advance, which obviously is the better way to go here because this is such a huge transition. But that's typically the case, is you've got one or the other, and there isn't enough education happening for adult children to really understand how quickly things can change for families. My family's a perfect example of that. My grandmother fell in the shower, and next thing we knew, she got diagnosed with dementia, and my family was scrambling to find a place, overnight, that could accommodate her needs. And it was a super stressful time for all of us, and it didn't necessarily have to be. And there were signs there was writing on the wall that no one was really paying attention to. But we also are not, we're not gerontologists, we're not
yeah,
specialists in
right.
senior housing or senior living, so we just didn't know what to look for at the time.
And were you in the business at that time
I
also?
w- I wasn't. I was getting into it though, and that just kind of like
Oh.
solidified my reasons for being here. Yeah, that and my other grandfather, after my grandmother passed, my mom thought it was a great idea to bring him into our home and to try to take care of him. And
Oh boy.
because he was on his own, he was lonely, so we're like, oh, the best thing for him is to be with family. But my parents work all day. He's sitting in the house by himself watching TV, not getting out of his chair, so like that wasn't very helpful either. So, we recognized that he needed to be in some type of a community setting where he could thrive and be amongst his peers as well. So I think, the family experience definitely will drive a lot of key decisions here. And I think it's something like 70 to 80% of all senior housing decisions are made by the families and not just by the seniors themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you're using AI kind of on both sides of the equation here. Can you give us a little reference point to where you're using AI? I can see a lot
Um,
of
yeah.
interesting data that could come in through AI.
Yeah. I mean, for me, because I've been in marketing for almost 30 years, like I've watched the entire landscape shift from, I mean, I grew up in a print shop. My parents own a printing business,
Oh
so I,
wow.
I was running a printing press by middle school, and like,
Hmm.
my first job out of college was designing websites and building websites, and then as an art director. So I got a feel for kind of like the analog side. Then I moved into digital, and then from there moved into the AI space. But I'll as technology has progressed, I've never seen technology as a replacement. I've always seen it as something that amplifies what it is that we do. It helps give me the space to focus on what I do best and not worry about all these other things. I've our agency, we've had an agency of 30 plus team members for 2 decades now. So I haven't been someone who's tried to, you know, run this solopreneur business and have like 1,500 different bots doing different things at the same time. I haven't had a need for that, but I will say that every single person on my team does have an agent or a bot that they use to help automate some of the workload that they do have, so that they can focus on what they do best. But we're subject matter experts in senior living, and on my team, each of our team members are all experts in what they do inside that space. So, for example, if we're putting together a performance report for one of the communities that we manage, we're going to use AI to help pull data from different sources and compile it into one space so that we're not having to manually pull all that information. We're just having to manually go through and just double check, cross our T's, dot our I's, make sure everything is accurate and correct. So it's a way for us to compile and optimize the operational side of what we do, so that the human side of what we do can kind of shine and make more sense of that data, if that's making sense. And then
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're not relying on it for um, doing your work, so to speak. You're relying on it to basically improve your work.
yeah, exactly. Like the point from A to B is still A to B. Like, and you can choose to allow AI to do everything for you in between A and B, and you, as the person on one side of the equation or the other, are either going to get nothing out of it if you automate the entire process, or you can allow yourself to be intimately involved and understand how all of those things work. And even the way that AI compiles data, for example, like we have these diagnostic tools with Norton, where we're pulling all of this market performance data from the internet and from all these different sources. But if we don't understand contextually what that data means, it's kind of worthless, because we could hand that report off to an investment committee and say, here you go, here's what the diagnostic is telling us about this asset. But they're not going to know how to make sense of that. So it's really taking it to the next level and saying, okay, based on the data that has been compiled, here's what our expertise is telling us, and here's how we're grading the data that we're seeing.
So I'm curious, of those 30 employees, are you half and half between Norton and your other side, or how's that work? Or maybe you're
Norton,
mixing the two.
yeah, no, we've been mixing the two, because I think they're intimately involved, because everything we're looking at in Norton is performance based on the work that we do on the marketing side of things. Not to say we would necessarily work with the same community or investment committee on both marketing and on assessing, risk for their capital investments, but we could. But we are using that same. It's the same expertise, the same skill set, the same data, understanding how an asset is performing in the market, whether it's for marketing purposes or whether it's for looking at it as an investment. We can use the same data for both, which is great.
I'm curious, how did you decide? Obviously, you're working on the marketing side, and then all of a sudden, I guess the light went on, and you said, "Hey, wait a minute. Did people come to you and say, 'Hey, could you evaluate this?' Or what? How'd that happen?"
That's a good question. So we have quite a few partners inside of senior living that, in whatever capacity, they consult with either operators or investment committees, and they're always talking about there's certain gaps in the data that they have. And for us, it started with, okay, we're managed when we were just marketing, we were managing communities from a marketing perspective, helping to develop, reputation management and digital footprint in terms of like their search visibility and things like that. But we weren't really looking at it from a portfolio perspective. It was so focused on one community. So step two for us was, okay, now let's look at the entire portfolio and let's diagnose, are there portfolio level things that are happening that maybe we can predict or see ahead of time and get ahead of it before it becomes a problem. So for example, like you might see occupancy might be shifting, or it might have already started, or it might be starting soon, and there might be other data points that are letting us know that that's happening. And when we look at the entire portfolio, we can say, oh yeah, these 5 communities, there's going to be a problem here in the next 6 months if we don't address, for example, their reputation. Like they've had 10 negative reviews come in the last 6 months. None of these have been addressed. These are systemic issues that need to be looked at. So we'll bring that to the operators' attention. So that was kind of phase 2, was like, how can we help the operators from a portfolio level? But then we started thinking, okay, now we've got the operators handled. What about the investors? The investors need to have a read as well. They need an independent read, just like the operators just have. But I can't look at a senior portfolio from a investor standpoint and share that with the operator side, because I'm basically telling the operator they're doing a good job or they're not doing a good job. And no one wants to hear that they're not doing a good job and here are the reasons, here's all the reasons why you're failing. But I can say that to the investment committee. And so I found that operators are more concerned with protecting themselves and not being forthcoming with the information they're sharing in terms of like why their NOI is where it is. Why are they not more profitable than they are? They'll blame things like seasonality, or they'll blame, that the lead quality isn't good enough, or the sales team is taking too. There's always some excuse that'll happen, but there might be 10 other things that are actually causing this asset to decline. And so that's a big problem, because if you look at like a 10% in an average community, if you look at a 10% swing in occupancy, that's like a $10 million difference in cap rate. In the value of that asset, based on if the cap rate was the same for an 80% occupancy versus 90%, it's like a $10 million difference in valuation. So you can imagine that, like, that's a huge swing for investors to know that, realistically, there's not a whole lot of increased cost to go from 80% to 90%. So like if you're at 90%, the amount of NOI you're going to hold on to is so much more than if you were at 80%.
So I'm curious, what's the typical senior housing facility? What's the average cap rate in that asset class?
It varies. I've heard it all across the board. If we look at like the standard like independent living community, I think it's around 6.8%. And then if you go to like assisted living, I think it goes up to like 7.8 or 8.5. And then memory care and skilled nursing, it gets a little higher just because the returns are more difficult to consistently produce in those spaces. And then like even like length of stay, if you look at that, like for independent living, length of stay is roughly like 8 to 10 years. Assisted living, it's like 22 to 28 months. And then memory care, it's like 18 to 22 months. So you can imagine
shrinking.
Very different. Yeah.
No wonder the cap rates go up.
Yep.
So that makes interesting. All right. Well, Jerry, this has been a very interesting conversation. I still have about 100 more questions, but maybe we need to reconvene down the road.
I love that.
So where can people get a hold of you, Jerry?
Yeah, no, thank you, Bruce, so much for your time today and the opportunity. And yeah, I'd love to come back and talk with your audience again. LinkedIn, if you want to find me on LinkedIn, Jerry Vinci, it's the easiest way. If you want to learn more about the operating facing side of senior living, you can check out our website, ccrgrowth.com. And if you want to learn more about the capital facing side and what goes into our independent diagnostic tools, you can go to Nordon, that's Nordon, advisory.com.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, I look forward to talking to you down the road here in 3 to 6 months, because I think things are changing that quickly, and there's tons more information to know about this whole class. So great to have you.
That's a wrap on today's journey through the SF commercial real estate scene. Ready to share your story? Visit sfcommercialconversations.com/guest. Your insights could lead the next conversation.